Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. This week's episode feels like a long time coming. I am talking to the designer, writer, publisher, and teacher Stuart Bertolotti-Bailey. Stuart, of course, was the co-founder and publisher of ... He's a co-founder of the Serving Library and is one half of Dexter Sinister, along with David Reinfurt. He also recently just took a new job as the head of design at the ICA in London. Stuart's name comes up often on this podcast, whether it's talking about the influence of ... or as an example of operating at the edge of graphic design. I previously interviewed Peter Bil'ak, who was his ... co-founder, and David Reinfurt was one of my very first interviews. So I was really excited to finally get the chance to talk with Stuart. In this conversation, Stuart and I talk about his design education and early design ambitions and how those changed thanks to a somewhat random introduction to Richard Hollis and the work of Carol Martins. We talk about the role of writing in his work and the similarities he sees between design and writing. And we also talk about his new job and what it's like to return to a somewhat traditional graphic design job after almost 2 decades of operating in various disciplines. We cover a lot in this one, and it's really fun to hear about his early career, which is something that I actually didn't know much about, and pick his brain about things like ... and the Serving Library and all of these projects that have really influenced my own thinking around graphic design. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Stuart Bertolotti-Bailey. I've been following your work for almost 10 years now, it seems like. I think I kind of was first introduced to you towards the end of ... And so I've known your work and your career primarily as a writer, as an editor, as a publisher, and less as, what we would think of as a kind of traditional designer. And so I thought an interesting place to start would be a little bit about kind of your background and how you got into all of this. Did you study design?
I did. I studied typography and graphic communication at the University of Reading, which is a school sort of due west out of London. It's maybe 30 minutes on the train max. And I'm from the north. I'm from just south of York, and so that's a good sort of 2-3 hours south. So I was really like leaving home to go and do an undergraduate course. And that course at the time, I wouldn't really have known this. One of the things about education that I find weird is that you sort of make these decisions to go places, but without any of the sophistication or knowledge that you would need to actually make an informed decision, right?
Yeah.
Everyone goes through this to some extent. And Reading was really the only university, meaning academic, non-vocational course in graphic design at that time, which today there wouldn't be that much of a distinction between sort of old school universities and things that were more like art schools, I guess.
Yeah.
That distinction isn't as kind of entrenched as it was then. But, when I was kind of looking through university brochures, that was really the only one that sort of popped up as a graphic design course at a university. And I'm not even sure why that was such a big deal. It wasn't like I was pressured to go to university or anything, but somehow just by accident, in the prospectuses that were in my local college of universities, that was the one that came up, and it sort of looked perfect for my interest. I got into graphic design like a lot of people, at least back then, did, through music.
Okay.
Was the usual story, and I only applied for that and one other fine art course actually somewhere in the north. So I was for whatever reason, I was pretty sort of committed to it before I actually even got up.
Yeah.
And it turned out that it was a fantastic course, still exists in a sort of debased form.
Okay.
And there isn't much of a priority with the undergraduate as opposed to postgraduate these days. It has a reputation for book design and type design,
right.
Specifically. But when I was there, which is sort of the early 90s, it was in the last couple of years of being directed by one of two people who'd founded it in the 60s, I think, which was an amazing thing. And it meant that this course had been sort of refined and refined and refined over 20, 30 years to the point where it was super specific, with an incredible, just the sort of weight of its own history and having done things in a certain way. It was definitely kind of modernist influenced in the sense of, there's a big distinction between sort of how modernism is conceived in the US and in Europe, especially in design terms. But it was definitely almost a socialist idea of graphic design and typography specifically, meaning it was seen as a sort of socially progressive thing to do. There was a lot of information design, and it was user-centered in a sort of old-fashioned sense.
Yeah.
And without proclaiming itself to be like that,
right.
that was just the ethos of the place. And it was a 4-year course, which is, pretty much unheard of for an undergraduate course, certainly in England these days. And it was, there wasn't any huge fees, etc., etc.
Right.
So I was pretty much in the last wave of when something like that was possible, and generally, and pretty much in the last wave of the course in the shape that it had been for the previous 20, 30 years. And the resources and the teachers and the sort of general atmosphere there was incredible. And there were things like, in the second and third years, there were 2 trips. One, just to give you some idea of the sort of rigor of the place, was one to Rome and Florence to study inscriptional lettering.
Okay.
Early Roman lettering was the focus, as well as architecture and all related things. And the second one was to Northern Europe, which took in Germany and Belgium and the Netherlands, which was to basically go to the Gutenberg Museum or the Fancy Moratus Museum, and sort of hardcore book design, printing press related things, but also took in like a talk at the Stedelijk Museum on Sandberg's posters by Gerard Unger, and stuff like that. Sort of thing that you just totally took for granted. It was just that thing that, you do in the second and third year. You're on a bus for, 10 days in this super concentrated way, getting up at 6 a.m. to go to the market in Rome and then walk around for 12 hours looking at inscriptional lettering. Nuts. And they've been doing this for, a good 10, 15 years. So just the level of what particular teachers were telling you was, I've never known anything like it before or since, really. So that was, just to say, it was an amazing course. It was called Typography and Graphic Communication, but it was essentially a graphic design course. But the particular thing about it, which has been, I guess, influential, was that because it was a university, there were lots of exams and writing and written work. And we all hated it. But we just wanted to make records. And we all had to, do essays about, historical and theoretical essays and exam questions, and it was taken very seriously, mock exams and all that. So, and a dissertation, really in the shape of a dissertation, mean not some, you can make it as a card index for, for something that you're loosely interested in. It was, a sort of 100-page, 40,000 word dissertation on something.
Oh, wow. So
there was definitely this rigor to it, is all I really want to say. And we all kind of left saying, thank God that's over. I'm never going to write another word in my life.
Oh, that's so interesting.
and quite a number of us went on to actually write quite a few more words in our lives.
Right.
And I have to say, I was in a, quote, good year. And there's lots of people, John Morgan, Fraser Muggeridge, people working in London at the moment who are fairly high profile, and definitely all have this, for better or worse, sort of solid Reading thing that can be an Achilles heel as much as a benefit.
So I have two questions that are kind of, maybe kind of weird. And one of them's a question that I always hate asking people this, but, hearing about this kind of very rigorous kind of traditional design education, when you were in school and kind of as you graduated, what were you thinking you wanted to do? Was it making record covers, or kind of what was your interest at that time when you were leaving that like you wanted to do?
Yeah, I mean, it's only a difficult question because it's hard to remember.
Yeah.
I guess general graphic design. There was definitely a bias towards book design there. Okay. And if there was one sort of thing that Reading graduates did, it was to go and work for Cambridge University Press or Oxford University Press.
Yeah.
That was, I mean, out of a year of whatever it was, 20 people, it wasn't like a lot of people could do that. It would be saturated. But it was a strange time as well, because it was like on the cusp of internet, basically. And we did like very, very rudimentary hypertext projects at the end. Email was barely there. I remember, one of my sort of colleagues on the course sending emails to his dad, who was an academic, and it was really before that happened. Yeah. So it's kind of strange to even think of it in those terms. So I guess I was imagining I would be designing books and printed matter, and it didn't really go much further than that. And I think the sort of little bits of freelance work that I did pick up in the first months after that were pretty much what I'm doing now. leaflets for art galleries and and stuff like that. And it took quite a while before any of that gelled, to sort of to be in any sort of direction. I will say that the one thing that happened that was really important to me right at the end, probably in the last couple of months at Reading, which is incredibly fortuitous, is that Robin Kinross, the design critic and publisher at Hyphen Press, came to he spent an afternoon doing a kind of free-form seminar. And it was on the back of an amazing teacher called Paul Stiff, who died a few years ago tragically. And he was like the final year tutor. He'd sort of put a sheet of paper on the wall and said, anyone that you're interested in trying to come and speak, write them down here and I'll do my best. And Robin was one of them. Mm-hmm. I think it was fairly shortly after his modern typography book. Wow. Out, stuff like that. And he was just quite important for a few of us there. And it was around the time that he had just met and written about Carol Martin's work. Okay. And he came and he did this talk that wasn't about Carol, but in retrospect, I think he was just trying to think through a few things. I remember the talk being more about architecture than about graphic design, but it sort of evolved into some wine glasses and 2 bottles of come to think of it. But he had a box of the journal that Carol made and still makes, Oasa, which means oasis. And we were just kind of handing these out, and they were hugely important to me. And just seeing, 10 of them, and the luxury of having that. And there's no real way I would have seen those in the flesh, as it were, otherwise. So that was hugely important. So I guess in in my mind's eye, that's the sort of thing I wanted to be doing.
Okay.
Cultural
Right.
work. Yes, I would never have thought of it in those terms, but arts-based work, and pretty much what I did end up getting into.
Yeah. So how I have two questions I'm trying to kind of figure out the best way. So how long after you had graduated from Reading did you end up going to, how long was that before Work Plots?
It was quite a long time. What happened was after, obviously it's hard to remember the timings of these things, but I think a few months after leaving, or after the summer, I ended up getting a job as an assistant art editor at a weekly architectural journal called the Architects Journal in London. In a way, a completely nondescript, page makeup job.
Okay.
And I really had no sense of what else to do. The curious thing that I only realized a number of years later was that there was really no culture of postgraduate study for whatever reason around. It wasn't even on the radar.
Yeah.
To go to, the Ammonite or the Rietveld or Yale or whatever. It really wasn't even a question. And I think that's particular to the UK at that time.
Okay.
And I think it has something to do with, island mentality.
Yeah.
I don't know what it was, but it wasn't until years later when I was in the Netherlands where that was pretty much a thing that you would at least think about after finishing an undergraduate course. I didn't even really know the term postgraduate. It was kind of strange.
It's so interesting.
So the idea of doing something like, the Work Plots didn't exist, but even if it had have done, I'm pretty sure, unless some auspicious connection through Robin or whatever, that I wouldn't have known about it, which is actually how it happened in the end. So the sort of obvious thing was to sort of gravitate to London, and so I remember applying for 2 or 3 magazine jobs while doing really little bits and pieces of stuff for galleries, and then started this job, and it was in a open plan office. It was like The Office, the TV series. It was completely shocking. I'm not kidding, and I was bowled over by how horrific. It wasn't horrific, normal, I guess, but to be without any other horizon, it's like,
yeah.
How do you get from that to something like
I know
Carol
exactly what you mean.
Robin or whoever are doing. However, so I did that, started that, and I ended up staying there for a year and a half, maybe. Anyway, so I was doing that, and in the gap between leaving Reading and moving to London, I'd met Richard Hollis, the design historian and fantastic graphic designer. I'd gone to interview him for my dissertation. So this is another reason why dissertations are good for you.
Yeah.
Kind of, gets you out of the house. So I'd gone to interview him. My dissertation was on modernism in Britain, modernism into Britain. And he called me up probably after I'd left and said, was I interested in coming around and helping him do some work as a bit of assistance? And basically I found out that he just got an Apple Mac. Wanted me to show him how to use it, and which was, it's a little bit of an exaggeration. He could already, but he definitely wasn't fluent.
This is amazing.
And the funny thing was, I was largely interested in Richard's work because of it being produced in a very tactile way through paste.
Right.
What we ended up doing, and this was just amazing, was sort of a hybrid of those two things. We would sort of typeset on the Mac, like super early Mac, and print out sort of galleys, make our own galleys of laser printed type, and then paste those up. So we sort of cut out the middleman of, probably what younger designers wouldn't be doing anymore anyway, but what Richard was used to through the 70s and 80s. and sort of do this kind of weird hybrid, and that was incredibly great and influential and strange, and the sort of final piece of the auspicious jigsaw of that situation was that his house and studio was literally 2 minutes walk from my job.
Oh, wow.
Of the Architect's Journal job.
Yeah.
Which, that was pure coincidence. So it meant that I could go there literally on my lunch hour on many occasions and do a bit of work. He'd feed me, and then I'd go back to work and do my, pretend to lay out an architectural journal.
Yeah.
And then go back and work in the evenings.
Mm-hmm.
And I sort of existed like that for a bit. And somehow it never really occurred to me even that was possible to do that in any sort of full-time way, which is strange because I was living at the time with John Morgan, who was a close friend and great designer and writer. And he, straight out of college, on a similarly lucky thing, ended up working for Derek Birdsall, contemporary of Richard Hollis's. They were both at the Central School, I think, in the 60s, and teaching at the same time, and were friends. And John had just he'd literally gone to see Derek on the day his former assistant was leaving. And he ended the day with a job, and John's a bit like that, even more than. And so he was doing that and had this, fantastic job doing amazing, book design and things as sort of Derek's right-hand man, and stayed there for a number of years. And so I was doing this sort of lower-end version of that with Richard. And the ways in which we were doing that were also very in line with the difference between Derek's character and situation and Richard's, in that Derek was always, he always had a giant studio and very rich clients and Yale University Press, and was very glamorous in a way. Yeah. And Richard was just in his basement, fiddling about with wax glue and just randomly accepting bits and pieces of work. So it was a funny time, and so that's what made the day job bearable, and why I kind of lasted there so long, meaning a year and a half. Was because of this parallel existence.
Right.
Really.
I mean, I guess that's kind of where I was getting at, or kind of what my question was, because it's so interesting to me to hear about this kind of early part of your career, which sounds very kind of traditional graphic design, very rigorous, very, kind of the modernist tradition. And then so much of your career, I feel like the kind of when I was introduced to your work is so outside of that world. And even ... I think this was an interview with you and Peter, or you and David, talking about kind of questioning, is if we put an article that's an essay that's not about graphic design in this, does it make it not a graphic design magazine? And that was something that you didn't really care about, and that you were just going to kind of put what you wanted in. So I'm kind of, what was the switch, or how did that kind of expanding your interests, where did that come in?
I think that was largely the fault of Paul Elliman.
Okay.
To be honest. So obviously there's this kind of multiple patriarchy of and it was a bit like that. It was Carol and Robin and Richard, and they're all in different ways, but sort of from the same stable somehow. Certainly a kind of lineage I felt attached to, or wanted to be attached to. They're also coming from the same direction. And okay, let me try and do this really quickly. So from that situation with the sort of schizophrenic Richard Hollis Architect's Journal thing, after a year or so at that job, the day job, I was so freaked out by that office situation, and especially the fact that everyone who worked there complained the whole time about working there, never did anything about it. Right. And I just had this thing where it's like, if I don't get out now, I'm just going to get trapped.
Right.
And so I started talking and thinking about going to, quote, the other side of the world. And what seems now remarkable to me is I didn't know anybody else outside England or have any other connection to
interesting.
that I can think of. And I said this at some point to my dad, and my dad said, "Oh, you should go and stay with my friend Tim." It turned out his friend he hadn't seen for 10 years. He studied architecture with, when back in the 60s or 50s, and was now living in Singapore. And he sent him a Christmas card once a year. And he said, "Oh, you should get in touch with Tim. He's on the other side of the world." Probably being sarcastic. And I did. And this guy was like, "Yeah, sure, come and stay." So I literally just dropped everything, resigned and went at the start of 97, so 20 years ago, literally on, the 2nd of January or something. It was Christmas, and then I left. And I was really going there, not thinking I would necessarily come back, or not for a while. And I wasn't interested in traveling. I wasn't a backpacker. I just wanted to go and work somewhere else and do something that wasn't that office thing. So I got there. Very long story short, this guy himself was going through a work crisis and left to go and live on the beach in Bali within about 3 weeks of my arriving, which in a way was a good thing because it forced me to get a job. And I did get a job in a design studio, in a small design studio called Wordmaker. Okay. And it was absolutely horrible, as bad as the London job, simply because the only thing that existed in Singapore was banks, really, shops, banks, or shopping malls, and basically the sort of company offices of large banks. So the only work there is really annual reports for banks. I'm not kidding. I mean, of the very few design studios that were there, that's what they were doing, and so that's what I was doing, annual reports for banks. So obviously not that much better than doing weekly layout for an architect's journal. But very different context, very nice bunch of people that I worked with, which was very lucky, who were quite international. And I lasted that out for about 9 months. And then it was pretty horrible. I was very lonely, and it was despite that studio. And I sort of gave up at some point, went to Australia for a month and landed in London. So at the end of 97, and I think the order in which this happened was I went back to do a bit of freelancing at the Architect's Journal because I had no more work or whatever.
Right.
And during that time, I think Robin must have sent me a prospectus for the Werkplatz. So that's when the Werkplatz typography wasn't even in existence yet.
Right.
I went to... There was something like I had a couple of months before the end of the year, and I was just like, basically, I'm just going to take the rest of the year off, which wasn't hard because I had nothing to do. And I went to visit Carol, which I think I'd done already once. And I went to visit him in the building that would become the school.
Okay. Yeah.
And so he was telling me, about the plans before it was even in existence. And all that existed was that prospectus and an empty building. And it was going to be another 9 months before the first year. So that happened. And then I came to the US for the first time to visit one of my colleagues on the typography course called Simon Daniels, who was the person who was most involved and interested in digital media, and he'd gone to work for Microsoft, and I think he's still there actually. So he was in Seattle. So 2 or 3 of us went to visit him, and I did a kind of cross country on my Amtrak trip, and ended up at Yale from Seattle.
Right.
And that's when I met Paul.
Okay.
And Paul was then professor in graphic design at Yale. And I didn't know who Paul was. The reason I went to see him was because I was trying to write something about chance in design. Okay. So I must have been really bored to have, within a year of leaving Reading and said, I'm never going to write again.
Yeah.
I was obviously sort of interested enough to sort of have this idea, I'm going to write a thing about chance in design.
Yeah.
Not sure who for, but I probably thought it would be for I magazine or something. And it turned out that it wasn't really chance per se I was interested in. It was systems. It was basically the sort of thing that Carol does that I was interested in terms of creating patterns that are based on some sort of system to do with color or numbers or music or whatever. And I was trying to bring together a number of things that I didn't know very much about into a piece of writing. And the name that kept cropping up when I would talk about this with people was Paul.
Okay.
So all this stuff is a coincidence, as you can tell.
Yeah.
It's sort of even now it seems very freaky to me. And
this is crazy.
What I gradually realised, and it took me a while to sort of see this, is as I'm describing it to you now, all the stuff that was happening was chance, right? In a very pointed way. And so I ended up quite a few months later turning that as a sort of travelogue in a way into a piece, which isn't particularly interesting, but did get published in Emigre, strangely. Okay. So that was sort of kind of parallel parking back into writing somehow through that whole strange experience. Anyway, all that is just to get to saying, and then I discovered Paul, and who became incredibly influential. I wouldn't say necessarily on me as a graphic designer, but certainly on ... and approaching things that weren't just sort of entrenched in the scene of graphic design, but connected to the world in obvious ways. That was the thing.
Well, and it seems like kind of when you did kind of figure that out, because I was kind of curious of kind of where the writing came back, and so now this is all starting to piece together. But it seems like once you figured that out, and once you met Paul, and then went to work plots, that you didn't have a desire anymore to kind of work in that traditional design context. And at least from the outside looking at your career, it seems like, at least, until now, where it's kind of you have a real design job again, the last 20 years have been you doing these things that are very independently driven and less commercial. Would you agree with that? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, of course. Yeah. But always totally by accident and never with any master plan. Yeah. And it's true enough what you just said. Like in the last 6 months when I started working at the ICA, it's the first time I've really had a proper job. You know? And I like that because I feel like I'm coming at that through the back door of having done these other things in publishing and working with David, Dexter Sinister, and sort of operating in these odd contemporary art contexts and things, and sort of coming back to a sort of straight graphic design or straightforward graphic design is far more interesting, having come back to it through having done all this other stuff rather than just having done that in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, so I love that, and I feel like this is so much of kind of what I talk about with people on this podcast, and so much about kind of what I'm trying to figure out in my own work. Do you think, I'm interested in how you think about publishing, writing, all of these other things, now that you're back in kind of a real design job. Do you think about design differently? Or do you think about this job differently now because of ... because of what you're doing with the serving library, all of these kind of other things you've been doing?
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, it's hard to say it's hard to imagine if I would have thought about it any different, if I would be doing it any differently now to, if I'd have been doing it 20 years ago, or if I'd done more straight graphic design all the way through. Is that true? I don't know. Who knows? I mean, to be honest, the new thing, the ICA thing, is so recent. Yeah. I haven't got enough of a handle on it to even give you a good answer about that, because I'm, in a certain way, I'm approaching it trying to approach it. So basically, I'm the head of design at the ICA, which means I'm the in-house designer. It's what interests me about it is the in-house aspect, which these days is pretty unusual.
Yeah,
certainly for an institution of that size, by which I mean fairly small. So at the Tate or MoMA, of course, or the Whitney, of course, they have in-house designers. But for somewhere like the ICA, it would be far more typical to sort of outsource to a studio.
Right.
And indeed, that's what they've been doing for years. And so the sort of integrated, integral aspect of being there in-house seems like a return to something that I agree with. It implies, a sort of commitment and a holistic sense of designing all aspects of the institution. But of course, you can't go back to something. It has to be a new. You have to make that idea new. That's why I did it, basically, because that's again. Without recent precedent, therefore, you've got nothing to base it on, except other people's ideas, which are usually not very. Other people's ideas of what that role should be, which are usually not very helpful. So what I'm battling with at the moment is, having never worked for an institution, trying to resist becoming institutionalized.
Right.
And sort of thinking, we can't possibly do that because of X, Y, and Z, which I do already, and trying to use the benefit of the lack of a conventional graphic design practice and being involved in writing and publishing, and bring that to bear on what we might do in a more interesting way. And of course, well, I don't know how much you know about the ICA, but the legacy of the ICA is, as a radical art institution, the playground of the avant-garde. So if there's anywhere that might, allow that to happen, at least in terms of its legacy, it's there. In agreeing to do it, in taking the job, I basically said I'll only do it if I can do it at least the website with David.
Okay. Yeah.
As a kind of Dexter Sinister thing, which really meant doing all of it with David. Is just, in the sense that he's a sort of constant sounding board, although I'm the one who's really responsible for everything.
Right.
And without that, I don't think I could have really hoped to bring some of the sort of expanded sense of graphic design and the contemporary art stuff to bear in such.
That's interesting.
And that is partly because he's not there.
Right.
Hopefully this will continue. That he's the one that's stopping me just becoming institutionalized in the negative sense,
right?
Because he's just like, what are you talking about? Of course we can do that, or we can at least suggest that, and so that seems to me necessary for the health of that situation.
Yeah, so this is interesting to me because I had read an interview that you had done. John Sueda interviewed you on Speak Up. I think this is like 12, 13 years ago now. And you said something, and I'm sorry to kind of quote back something you said a decade ago, but where you were kind of, I'm paraphrasing, but you were kind of up against the term graphic design, and what graphic design has come to represent is not what you were interested in anymore. And that really resonates with me. And in conversations that I have with people, and actually David and I talked about this when I talked to him, of how valuable is that term graphic design anymore, especially in 2017, when it can mean all of these different things. And as someone who has worked really on the edges of that for so long, now being in an institution, does that something that you still feel like, or has your relationship with that word graphic design changed at all?
I think what I was getting at then when I said that was much more to do with what it means to other people, and how that can be limiting and the idea of graphic design was, become so ubiquitous because all the desktop publishing, and everyone knows what fonts are, and everyone has 100 fonts on their laptop or whatever. The graphic design, I think, had become, in the minds of a lot of people who might be on the fringes of it or commissioning you, indeed, the tail end of a process. This is what I would have I would say, right? Where you're really just prettifying something.
Yes. Yeah.
Or it can be more progressive than that. It can be information design or infographics or whatever that aren't just about selling things, but you're not involved in what I would call designing, which is, sort of thinking through problems isn't necessarily the right term, but thinking through material and how to articulate it from a stage in the process where you can still affect fundamentally how it's going to come across one way or another to an audience, rather than just making it green or blue or Universe or Helvetica or Times.
Right.
And it had seemed to have become that reductive version in the minds of a lot of people who might have recourse to use the term. And now it's like, I don't mind being a graphic. In fact, I chose my own job title at the ICA.
Oh.
I mean, Stefan, the director, at some point, I got a text. He was like, "What do you want to be called? What do you want to be called on your contract?"
Yeah.
And I said head of design, and it could have been something far more expansive or complicated. And that was partly just because I was like, that's what that job would have been in the 50s or 60s, and
that's so interesting.
And I'd rather do that and then sort of try and reinvent or re-expand what design meant, rather than it becoming something like head of communications outreach.
Yeah. I love that.
And curiously enough, a couple of months after me, there is someone who works alongside me who is head of communications. And so there's a distinction there between design and communications, which effectively suggests that I'm responsible for, indeed, the surface of things. And so this job involves everything from stationery, internal documents, building signage, exhibition design to some degree, the website, email announcements, everything that anyone would see. But definitely I and everybody else has a vested interest in me being involved in the tone of voice of the place, or how are things on the website written in paragraphs with links within the sentences, or are they lists or drop-down menus? And this is the big advantage and difficulty in many ways of being integrally involved from the beginning, rather than just being told by somebody, this is what we're doing, make it red or blue or Universe or Helvetica. It's a huge responsibility, and is definitely the fact of being able to do that, or wanting to do that, or knowing that is a good thing to do and be involved in, certainly has to come from having done that through publishing and editing for the last 20 years. And Stefan, the director, who I've worked with before when he was at Artist Space, and me and David made again a sort of auspicious piece of work called Identity, which is about institutional identity.
That's right.
So the weird thing about the ICA thing is that it's an opportunity to sort of put some of the, let's say, theoretical, in a kind of speculative contemporary art sense, things that came out of that film, if that's what it was, animation, into actual practice.
That's so interesting.
Through an actual contemporary art institution with, as it happens, the person who commissioned that thing in the first place.
Yeah.
6 years later.
That's really what you just said was interesting to me, because you sent me the first kind of website that you did with David for the ICA, and I was struck by how it was very ICA but also very Dexter Sinister, and I mean that as a compliment, that you as a designer, your voice was a part of that. It was not you kind of being institutionalized. And so what you're talking about, I see that already.
Watch this space.
Yeah.
Might go downhill very quickly.
Right.
And I really do, joking apart, I mean, I'm not sure how, if we're going to be able to sort of maintain that, or how that will come across once it really has to do the proper job of all the things the ICA website has to do. One of the things that makes the ICA specific and a huge challenge is that, at least in the UK, there's nowhere else like it in the sense of how many different types of activities it does, particularly because it's a fully functioning cinema, meaning it has 6 or 7 films a day, apart from Mondays when the building's shut, as well as a bookstore, restaurant and cafe, a theatre, music events, live events, and exhibition spaces, and it does stuff like venue hire. So to just give you some idea, one of the other things I'm tasked with is doing hires brochures to rent out spaces for weddings.
Oh wow!
So it's from that sort of,
that's so interesting,
like, super kind of commercial thing, to far more experimental things that we might end up doing with the website, or certain spin-off projects from that.
Are you doing kind of any writing outside of now your day job, or do you have any desire to go back to that kind of work?
Not particularly. I mean, I've never really thought of myself as a writer, and if I have done bits and pieces of writing, and when I do, actually, they're usually longer than shorter, as you probably know. I have a hard time editing myself. They usually grow out of some other situation, like a seminar or a talk, that I then convert into a piece, almost to trick myself into doing it. I used to talk about doing that when we were doing ... in the early years a lot. Is like tricking people who aren't used to writing into writing.
Oh, I love that.
By just telling them to write it in an email or something like that. And I have to do that with myself still. And I did a PhD a few years ago, and
I've started reading it. There's a PDF online. I haven't finished it yet.
I mean, I barely finished it myself. And that was a torturous thing, very luxurious thing to complain about, but I didn't have a nice time doing it. But it's become an incredibly useful resource for me, partly because I often chop it up and give bits and pieces to students, and it's just a very good bank of things to have. And if you start looking at it, you'll know it's sort of half of it are just documents of projects that me and David have done anyway, that usually involve a lot of writing in many different forms. And it took me a stupidly long time to realize that could be the backbone of the PhD as a whole, and it could essentially be a container for all those other bits and pieces of writing, with me sort of joining them together with a kind of glue text. So again, I sort of tricked myself into doing it, and once that became apparent, I could get somewhere with it. But even that, I mean, it's probably hundreds of thousands of words. Partly because it contains all these other many thousands of words that existed beforehand. And I don't think of myself as having written it somehow. I don't. It just sort of happened, and so no. I mean, David does. David can sit down and write an essay about something, like what Minari, the ones he did recently, or the book on a million random digits or whatever. He can do that. I can't do that.
Oh, that's interesting.
I don't have the mind to be sort of interested in a subject in an obvious way. and then just sit down and string together an argument. I'm much better at writing together with David. We have quite a good facility for doing that, which seems quite special. But there are things, and there's one that happened very recently where, again, I still sort of trick myself into writing. So often there's some kind of mundane seeming task that we or I kind of managed to flip into it being productive than just being mundane or prosaic. So, for instance, recently we've, as we periodically do, changed the format of the journal, which is now the Serving Library Annual. It's suddenly bigger. It's sort of on steroids. It's once a year and twice a year for the first time. And that required some sort of announcement specifically for our subscribers, that would say, basically, if you paid for a 2-year subscription, rather than get 4 issues, you're now only going to get 2. And you'd have to make a good case for why that is.
Yeah.
And it's probably not a very legally binding. And anyone that argues, whoever's listening to this, could, if they just say, well, I'm not accepting that, send me 4 issues, we'll probably say, all right. But certainly for, libraries and institutions that have subscriptions as much as anything because they support us or want to support us, rather than individuals, it was necessary to do that. And it's a sort of text that we end up doing many of these things, email announcement paragraphs, bio, little bios, the sort of stuff that's really like the bane of existence of this sort of thing, because they should be easy, they should take 10 minutes. Inevitably they take longer than any other thing we're trying to do. And so I already had a kind of fear of this, paragraph to the subscribers. And then I got invited to contribute to a book series by a publisher called Open Editions, run by a guy called David Blamey that I met doing external examining at the Royal College last year. And the next one is on distribution, and he invited me if I was interested in writing a piece. And so I thought, I'll do this subscribers letter as the piece for the book. And it's often like those little things
that's interesting,
that make things interesting for me anyway. And it often, actually, I'd never quite thought this clearly, but it's often when they do serve more than one purpose, because it gives you a shape or a tone of voice that might be a bit out of the ordinary. And I think what characterized a lot of Dot's writing and how it was edited, and still does to some extent with Serving Library stuff, is a sort of unusual things done with the form of writing that are usually, for want of a better word, structural or architectural, which might be like numbering paragraphs, or writing it backwards. Or starting with the last part. It's just some strange scaffolding. I always used to talk about in terms of scaffold, where you sort of have this conceit that gets you, is the impetus for doing it, because it's a bit unusual, and it may well fall away, and you don't need it by the end. It might just serve a purpose, like a rabbit in greyhound racing, or a decoy, or it may well remain at the end.
That's so interesting. I mean, because that's one of the biggest things that I love about ... It's not just the content and what you're saying, but how the writing is structured. And I always think of Rob Giampitro's pieces in ... I love everything that he does, but I think the stuff that he did for you is some of his most formally interesting writing. It's just so different than his kind of usual.
And people love it. It's like we spend a lot of time going back and forward with writers. Not in a kind of, annoying editorial imposition kind of way, but just to develop something and make it more interesting or sort of compulsive somehow. And for the most part, people really appreciate that.
Yeah.
There's 5% of people who get upset about it,
right.
and I think that's where the design aspect still exists in the writing for me. I think that structural thing is looking at writing and almost visually writing
totally.
it.
I get it. Yeah.
And when David and I started writing together, when we first started Dexter Sinister, we were making little text that explained the basement space, or we did this funny text called we would like to share some thoughts on the school badge for the manifesto thing we started. Like, we literally sat down and wrote it together at a screen, which, as I say, is quite a kind of unusual thing to be able to do. And we'd sit there and say things like, I have the feeling that the piece, before we'd even start, should be 8 paragraphs, or it has to all fit on a page.
Yeah.
Or half of it should be quotes, just stuff that doesn't really make sense until you've written it. But there's this sort of visual editing that you're doing in the abstract. I think because of that sort of, design specific skill of iterating. Right? That's the posh word for it, of sketching in the abstract.
I love that.
And I think that's what made the writing ... particular, and it absolutely still happens with bulletins. It just, in bulletins, it doesn't have a visual component,
right?
Because it just gets poured into that natural format. But if you read it, it's still absolutely
totally
there.
I'm very curious, especially for you in the position that the various positions you've been in the design world today, 2017, 2018, what are the issues or topics or subjects that designers should be talking about right now? Or what are the things design writers you would want to see more people writing about, or the issues kind of facing the profession or the discourse or the practice today?
That is a hard question.
That's why I saved this one for the end.
Yeah, God. I mean, it's hard not to reflexively answer that with some sort of some sort of political address. That I'm not sure what that would be in design terms. I've never really read or taken much notice of other design writing or art writing, really, or writing in general. I mean, I'm much more like a fiction reader, than non-fiction reader.
Yeah.
And actually, that's another funny left-right Dexter Sinister distinction between me and David, and we often kind of joke about that as well. He only reads non-fiction. He'll read a maths textbook in bed, and I pretty much only read fiction.
This is great, because my next question was going to be, what do you read, or what do you like to read? So this is perfect.
Yeah. So, but in terms of, design journals, design writing, I never really have, apart from when I was a student. Then I was really very much interested. Yeah. And, as I said, on my lunch hour, I would be at the design bookshelves, and that fell away quite quickly after sort of starting the workplace or something. Or maybe just because I was starting my own thing in terms of writing and editing. And that sort of replaced the need for that, because of course I am reading the people whose text we're commissioning or working on, and for me I guess it's almost like the energy that takes sort of stops me.
That makes sense.
Having the sort of capacity for anything else. And another exception was when I was doing the PhD. I did force myself in a way to read a lot more, although that was sort of more art theory and philosophy and sociology a little bit. really, really rudimentary things, and even then, not many things. So that's partly why I find that question difficult to answer. I think I still sort of believe and feel like I'm part of. I would like to be part of some social impulse in design, and of course making the things that we do, whether it's the journal or the space that we have in Liverpool and various bits and pieces of teaching, are trying to make people think and trying to make people consider ethical things,
right?
But they're usually at a fairly abstracted level rather than directed towards particular social political causes. And I think then they're no less valid for that. But in days like these, it's definitely the case that that you feel like there has to be something that is far more direct, whether it's us or other people doing that. And we talk about that among ourselves editorially quite a lot. And the new issue is a kind of a step more obviously capital P political than we ever have been. So I guess, what am I flailing to say here? The sorts of things that I ended up talking with the last time I had a design specific teaching job, which was actually at Otis in LA. And I had a kind of lovely sort of bunch of students, and we were sort of doing design writing about design issues. And this is the last time I really sort of thought about this in a focused way. And one of the things, just a tiny little, that we did once was I said for next week's class, I want you to all bring in a bag 5 websites that you appreciate for their design. And I was careful to say by that I emphatically don't mean how they look, I mean how they work. And so they all brought their selections, and it was very interesting and telling that they were all, the ones that they brought, 90% of them were all very common, super ubiquitous things.
Oh, interesting.
Like Wikipedia or Craigslist or Reddit or sort of like the top 10.
Yeah.
And I thought that was really interesting, especially because it was designers doing that. And I still haven't quite passed what that means or why it seems significant to me, but the idea that probably why those websites register as well-made things is because they've probably been touched by many, many people rather than a single designer.
Yeah.
And I'm presuming there's an awful lot of user feedback that directly feeds back into immediate changes, or let's say relatively immediate changes. And to me, that the sort of community and sort of ethical aspect of that, the communal aspect of that, seems well worth thinking about and possibly writing about.
Yeah.
And
that is interesting.
And I'm curious, and it's one of the things that would, I've sort of said this in other places before. It's like if I was setting up a design school, which I'm not today, I think programming would be one of the fundamental things that I teach. And of course, there are places that do that.
Yeah.
And I think that's absolutely right, because it's the work. At Reading, one of the other great things was we had an in-house printing department that was deliberately set up so that you would be on the press all the time. And we would do real jobs for the university and surrounding, institutions and individuals. And we would see the thing through from the beginning. We'd literally be on the machine.
Oh, that's great.
And obviously the equivalent of that in digital media is to be in the engine room of where the coding is happening. So I think I think an emphasis from design as surface and as that sort of designer aspect of design, right? The surface aspect of design just seems it's everywhere.
Yep.
Everyone can do it. It's not that interesting.
Yeah.
It's to be a designer in that sense. All you have to do is look about and either copy stuff or advanced stuff. It doesn't seem that difficult to me. But the difficult stuff seems to be more genuinely making things easy to use and still being interesting.
Yeah.
And one thing I was reminded about with this book that I said just came out on Richard Hollis's work is that he always talks about graphic design as being social work. It's not being funny. I mean, he as a form of social work.
Yeah.
And that book he explicitly says, it's like the thing that you're making fundamentally first has to work in a really blatant way. You have to be able to read the title. You have to know what you're clicking on. You have to get things in order. The first sentence of the paragraph has to make sense in terms of it coming before the second one. Stuff that you'll be surprised that students can't do in a fundamental way. Write a paragraph that makes sense. And I think without that sort of fundamental skill and sacrificing that for the sort of personal project that's to do with the fact that you are interested in bird sounds and you're going to and you're going to make a book about it, a chap book about birds, that sort of design project. I think if fine, I'm all for people being interested and involved in what they're doing, but I think it's often at the expense of really fundamental skills. And I guess now on the soapbox, I think any teaching or writing, I don't know how it would be done in an interesting way, but would be sort of getting back to
I love that
a priority of things working. What Richard says in the book is like fundamentally it's got to just function in a really basic way, whatever it is. And then by all means you can sort of add anything is delightful or entertaining or the kind of surplus, which might be stylistic or whatever, but it has to be in that order,
right?
Or there has to be no distinction where the kind of more interesting in a graphic design sense aspect is outweighing the fact of it just doesn't work. And so what I'm curious about with something like this ICA website is how much I can take that sort of high-minded opinion and try and make something that, of course, me and David want to make something absolutely specific and great and weird and propulsive somehow, but that also has to answer to all these different departments that the ICA has, and all the, huge potential audience and different audiences that are going to have to use it, and sort of how to answer to all of that in a way that I'm talking about with Wikipedia or whatever. As a model, without it being done purely because it's conventional.
Right.
So it's
that's so interesting.
So how to go against? So how not to go against the conventions for the sake of a sort of father killing. Like it's going to do something different for the sake of being different. Versus something being specific and workable, answerable. I mean, answerable is there was that word answerable was in that prospectus for the Werkplatz that I came across on coming back from Singapore that led to me going to the Werkplatz. It was originally written in Dutch by Carolyn Viggerbeem, who he started the school with, and it's translated into English by Robin. and that's the word I always remember is them saying the school was set up to make work that was based on real work rather than fictional projects, which it isn't anymore. But that was very much the idea, because it's only in actual real material that work can be answerable. Meaning,
love that.
It's answerable in the sense that you don't have to stand behind pointing at what's good about it. It speaks for itself. It's answerable for itself.
Yeah.
I think a sort of a design writing or education would benefit from some sort of return to that or making new of that.
That's great. I love that. That is such a. I love that word answerable. I've never kind of heard design defined that way, or good design defined that way, and I think there's something really interesting about that, actually. Yeah. My last question, which is hopefully a kind of quick question. You've kind of started answering it throughout this whole conversation. I'm very interested in the writers, the authors, the books that have really influenced you, the way you think about these things. That if you were kind of making a reading list, who would be on it?
Well, as you probably know, if you've read stuff that I've written in the last 5-10 years, I'm a huge David Foster Wallace fan.
Yeah.
I think in a way, discovering his writing was almost like a re-entry to design somehow, because in a way, what I just said before about what characterizes a lot of the writing that we've been involved in commissioning and writing ourselves is, I don't think of it necessarily as experimental at all, but is often structurally unusual or eccentric, and as I say, often just for the sort of to put a firework under the writing into doing it in the first place, and obviously Foster Wallace is sort of structurally is beyond compare, and just that facility of self-reflection to the nth degree, a sickening sense of self-reflexivity, which of course Dot was kind of marked by. And then on reading him, I was like, oh, we were nothing compared to this. But just the kind of sheer capacity for the sort of thinking that he did. It was just a huge influence. Of course, it's sort of almost passé at this point to sort of to kind of cite him in those terms. But for me, it was that was the big thing from the last 10 years. And so I could, of my reading list of 10, there would be 10.
Okay.
Books. But I'll tell you one. I'll sort of recommend one for anyone who is listening to this, which is something that we republished.
Okay.
As a bulletin. I have no idea how we got the rights. We actually officially got the rights to do this. And I don't know if you come across it on the website, but it's a piece called something like the Anthology of Prose Poetry.
Yeah. I remember this.
Amazing piece. And I mean, I feel like now I just want to teach a class only about that. So basically the story was he was asked to do a book review.
Right.
Of this anthology of prose poetry, right? It's super rarefied, very contemporary, very American, sort of sub literary genre. And he was obviously not impressed with both the premise of that sub genre in the first place, and the sort of conceit and nepotism of this publication. The best of the best of the prose. Right. Anyway, so it's an anthology of a journal, and of which probably 14 people read. Which is, and he just what he does is he's only given a certain number of words for this book review. Let's say 1,000 words. So he concocts this system to be able to say as much as he can in a ruthlessly sarcastic, sardonic way that, of course, at the same time, him being him, makes absolutely serious points that have nothing to do with literature whatsoever, but are also political in some way. By setting up a question and answer format, where it says something like number of pages in anthology.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And then it's 256, whereby he justifies the fact that any of the words before the colon don't count as his word count.
Yeah.
And also numbers don't count because they're not words, they're not letters, so they don't count as words. So, and it's hilarious and an absolute virtuoso thing.
Yes.
And I read it it's in one of the anthologies of nonfiction, and I thought it was amazing. And then, but what you've got to do is seek out the original scan, because what they did when they published it in whatever the journal was that commissioned it is it was so many words, but they only had the regular space that they would allow as magazines work, that they had to shrink the type size to like 4-point type.
Oh, that's amazing.
So visually, it's hilarious. And what I love about it is you see the idea immediately.
Yeah.
And that's why it seems to me like a really useful example of something to talk about with graphic design students, because it looks like what it is immediately. And it was almost like a sort of the Rosetta Stone of a ... piece.
Yeah.
That I never knew about
for
the whole existence of ... I was probably only written about 10 years after I started anyway. So he was a return to sort of thinking that through.
I'm as soon as you said that, I totally see that influence. I'm actually kind of surprised that he hasn't come up in any of these other conversations that I've had with people for the podcast. Right. So I'm glad we finally got him.
Yeah,
got him on.
And
here.
the other people that are just the people that I've written things about in ... or whatever. So Salinger is still a huge favorite of mine. I mean, really obvious sort of people are not B.S. Johnson, British writer who I've written about a bit as well.
Like I said at the beginning, I've been kind of following your work for years now, so I'm so glad that we got to do this. So thank you so much for talking with me.
You're welcome.
This episode was recorded on December 10th, 2017. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us on Apple Podcasts and SoundCloud and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.